Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science. Man, we've gotten blown up with all these questions and everything. And one of the, a while ago, I guess a couple of weeks ago, we polled the audience, looked for questions, and one thing that kept surfacing, and that was a really popular question and comment, was basically, could we walk people through the process that we're going through? And I think that is from a multiple perspectives of what does the process look like to develop a research experiment? Where does the question come from? How does the funding work? How's the interaction with the state agency and the university happening? And then also more practical things related to what's the process we go through to design a robust study to evaluate some kind of hypothesis or objective. So I guess with that, we wanted to devote an episode to it. I thought, and I think you agree, I thought this would be a really fun one because this is one of the things that I really love about the job is trying to come up with clever ways to isolate variables of interest to solve problems.
Mm-hmm.
And or at least get enough information to make decisions,
right.
An educated decision. So I really enjoy that part of it, and I think this will be a fun episode for us to talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to study for it.
We've been studying our whole lives for this.
Right, that's right. Waiting on this moment.
Yeah.
That's so really good and interesting question. I guess, going all the way back to the origin of a research project, typically my experience has been that we establish objectives one of two ways, right? So one is, and this one occurs pretty regularly, is where a funding organization, most oftentimes a state wildlife agency, identifies a research priority. So, let's just say we want to know about turkey disease prevalence and distribution throughout the state. And so more often than not, they go to the land grant university in their state, which is typically the university that has the major wildlife program and the faculty that are research focused. And they say, we have this set of objectives. Can you put us together a proposal on how you would address them?
Mm-hmm.
The other way is, and man, this is the really fun one to get, right, is when a funding organization comes to you and says, hey, we have this pot of money that we want to use to help improve our management of wild turkeys. What are some ideas or some things, some important questions that you think we need to address? So help us establish the objectives.
Right. Yeah, those are pretty typical. In some cases, also, I have been in this situation before. A lot of times we have ideas and we approach different organizations, whether it's a state agency or a nonprofit or whatever, or in some cases as some sort of private funding.
Mm-hmm.
But we basically have an idea that we're trying to get someone interested in funding.
Yeah.
So, that's probably more uncommon, but that's also another way. And just to give people another look at that process, there are other agencies or organizations that have a process that's very similar to what you said about them basically coming to you and asking you how to address it, an objective, but we'd call that a request for proposals. So that's pretty typical of a lot of our federal agencies. They'll have a request for proposals, and they might have some loosely defined objectives in it. Like they have some priority areas, like it may be wildlife health or,
improving abundance estimates for wild turkey populations.
Yeah, it may be something really general. The Wild Turkey Federation just recently had an RFP that came out to all the states where they requested proposals, and they had
like 5 or 6 priority areas.
Yeah, they had some, which there's various ways that those we need to talk about that too. How do those objectives get developed?
Right.
But they're more broad, and they're just looking for, hey, we got a bunch of scientists that are working on things and have different ideas about how to address a priority area, and it's pretty general, and they're just looking for really good ideas. So that's pretty common. I find myself when I'm thinking about those kinds of opportunities, one thing is if it's a federal RFP, man, that is a process trying to put together a proposal for it. And I also find myself as the things that I think are needed or I want to do, I'm having to kind of mold them into something that would fit into an objective, as opposed to the state agency model where we want to study wild turkeys and benefit wild turkeys, and they have identified a problem, and then we're trying to figure out how to address that through a study. So all of those things can happen. I have done it in all of those ways.
Yeah.
So, but the state agency model is pretty typical, that they have identified some objectives that they bring to the researchers and ask for ideas on how to address them.
Yeah, a lot of times within that model, a state agency will have multiple committees that are dedicated towards thinking about different groups of species or species throughout the state. So most every state has a deer program coordinator and a turkey program coordinator, at least, because those are oftentimes, especially in the eastern United States, the two most popular, heavily pursued game species. And so, for instance, the turkey committee likely comes together, and that may be comprised of 5 or 6 biologists from around the state that are all, like diehard turkey hunters / turkey managers, and know a lot about turkeys, have that solid background knowledge, and are kind of up to date on what we need to know and what we do know already. And that committee will establish a set of research priorities that may be broad, like you just mentioned, or they may be even more narrowly focused. And then they will send that research priority list along to their supervisors, up onto maybe like an assistant chief or a chief of the wildlife agency, and then that person will put together a call for proposals, and they will choose out of the identified research interest of each of these different committees around the state which one of those are going to be pushed forward to researchers for them to in turn submit a proposal on how they would address that objective.
Yeah. The other thing I will add is that it can be structured differently in different states in terms of how they go about that. Some states will have an open call where it may go to researchers, like for instance, around the Southeast, or it may just be even more open where anybody that wants to respond to it can do it. I think it's a little more typical for state agency to try to keep that within the state with the people they have working in the state, but sometimes they don't have people working on what their needs are.
Right.
And I'm talking about more broadly from turkeys, like it's the wildlife agency. We're talking about all the different wildlife work that might be needed. Another thing that is typical of some states, like here in Florida, is they have a research wing in the state agency.
Yeah.
So they're addressing a lot of the research questions that are arising in-house, or partnering. Those scientists partner with the university commonly. I'm doing that with the turkey research and the deer research right now in Florida. So, there are different ways that can happen. Another thing about the objectives, those can arise from different ways, like you mentioned, that may be amongst biologists that are talking about issues that they need to do. Sometimes it's coming from public.
Mm-hmm.
So various ways that, I would hesitate to say the word pressure, but we'll just think of it that way. That kind of gives it a negative connotation, I feel like, but I don't mean it that way. There's public interest in a topic being addressed. And if there's enough of that and it keeps coming up enough, then that, brings the objective higher on the list. In some cases, it makes things happen that would not have happened otherwise.
Yeah.
Or at least increases their priority. Sometimes it's coming from knowing trends and data. Like if your harvest data is trending negative after something happened, that might stimulate a research project to figure out, are they linked? Like, is this thing that happened causing a change in harvest rate? Or, you see a downturn in the population and that raises a concern about, what is causing that, and it just stimulates that process. Okay, we need to figure out what's happening. What are your ideas for what's happening?
Or the state agency maybe even already has a plan related to regulation change to address what's happening, and they want to evaluate the effectiveness of that regulation change.
Yeah. So it can arise from lots of different ways, and sometimes it's coming from the constituents. So I just want to make that clear to people. Being involved in the town hall meetings, or whatever opportunities you have to be involved, it can stimulate the type of work that you'd like to see or think is needed.
Yeah.
So, anything else we need to talk about on that front?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Well, how do you go about addressing a question? What does that process look like? Let's just pick one. So what's a problem? Like maybe you've got a project that's ongoing. Can you talk us through the process that you went through?
Or, yeah, I mean, we could, or we just go through a hypothetical, I guess.
We'll do a hypothetical.
I mean, because we've talked about, are we belaboring it if we talk about a predation study again? Because we've talked about that in previous episodes.
Yeah, let's do something different than that one, since we've already done that one.
All right. So we will go through a real world example. So I'm looking to hire a PhD student right now to run a project that is focused on, and you guys will probably get a kick out of this because I was prompted to a significant degree to put this project together based on some of the listener feedback that we were getting that was really helping me appreciate how many people want to manage habitat for turkeys that for one reason or another can't implement prescribed fire.
Yeah.
Okay.
We even had questions when we did the Q&A. We have multiple questions. What if fire isn't in your toolbox, or what if you have bottomland hardwood, or there's various circumstances where fire isn't the tool of choice, or they want to know if it is.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
And that listener feedback really opened my eyes to that question because we've spent enough time together now that you understand that I'm a pretty black and white kind of guy. Like I don't oftentimes see a lot of gray areas in things. And so previously my thoughts on that were, well, you need to figure out how to burn, like, I don't care if you got to get legislation changed in your state, you need to figure out how to burn. But I realize that that's not practical. That's not a real world solution a lot of times. And even if it is, we need options in the interim. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to look into alternative ways to manage vegetation and see how that actually compares to the plant community that's stimulated by fire. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I had, and maybe this isn't the best example because it is somewhat of a non-traditional way of getting a project funded. But I had this idea in my back pocket, and I found out about this family foundation in North Carolina that was interested in projects that related to enhancing and sustaining biodiversity in areas throughout the Southeast. And I was like, man, like, this vegetation management project has implications not just for turkeys and deer, which are primarily oftentimes what I'm interested in, but it affects the whole, wildlife community out there,
Mm-hmm.
and everything, from pollinators up to apex predators and large mammals, right? And everything in
Mm-hmm.
between. So it seemed relevant to them, and they asked for a pre-proposal that was just like a one pager, and I just jotted down my ideas, like, this is the problem that I'm seeing, these are some potential solutions, and this is how we might address that question. Sent it into them, and they said, yeah, we want to see a full proposal with more detail outlining the experimental design and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of the first step in the process. And so I guess when you get to that point, you're starting to think about the experimental design. The next step is thinking about the experimental design. How are you going to lay it out? And then that can help inform the amount of money for operations and the personnel that you're going to need to implement that work in the field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that part to me, I really enjoy it. I don't know. It's just like we're already to a point now where we have a question. We're trying to isolate a variable. How do we do that? Because you often have to be very clever
Mm-hmm.
about how you structure things to make sure that you're actually testing the hypothesis you're isolating
Right.
the variable that you're trying to from other potential influences. How do you structure everything such that you achieve that?
And that is the most difficult aspect of a research project if it involves monitoring vital rates of animals or behavioral responses or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is, you start thinking about, and I know this isn't in line with the vegetation project that I just talked about, but I think it's probably more
Well,
interesting and relevant.
yeah. Hang on just a second. I
Okay.
think it is, but that vegetation project that you just talked about,
Mm-hmm.
it's more clear cut on how you might design that. We're looking at
Absolutely.
we want to capture variability across sites, so we're going to have multiple
Yeah.
sites. We also have a variety of treatments we want to evaluate in comparison to a control, which in
Mm-hmm.
this case you could define as fire,
Mm-hmm.
like because your objective was to compare things to the response you see from fire, or more typically in a bunch of studies, the control will be do nothing. So it's
Yeah.
just whatever the existing stuff is. And then you'd have fire and herbicide or mowing or whatever
Right.
else your
Right.
vegetation treatments are. And you basically develop what we'd call a randomized block design.
Yeah.
And you're blocking on the site. So we typically want 5 or more of those sites. And, you kind of decide how far they need to be apart to be independent from one another. So they're often different properties, but not necessarily, depending on the question, how you're
Mm-hmm.
evaluating things. But with vegetation, you can even do them pretty much right together.
Yeah. You got a captive audience.
Yeah, like the plant's going to be in there. You're going to
Yeah.
see the response.
Yeah.
There's not much influence between them, so they don't have to be that far apart. And they're not going to travel. Like the plant's not. You're not trying to track
Yeah.
the same individual over 10,000 acres. So,
Yeah.
uh, all of those things make us lean toward that kind of experiment. I've done a ton of that kind of work. I know you have. Uh, we have a lot of habitat work that has been plant centric, and we have very
Mm-hmm.
good data on a bunch of things like plant
Yeah.
response to fire, for instance. We have
Yeah.
very good data on what to expect. And then we're taking our knowledge of the species of interest, in this case, turkeys, and trying to apply what we see happen in that treatment to what we would expect the response of the animal to be.
Mm-hmm.
That's the key thing there is we're expecting this response of the animal to that based on what we know about the animal rather than what I think you were about to go in, and now I'll let
Yeah.
you go back to it, is actually
Yeah.
measuring the behavioral or vital rate or both responses to your treatment, which is a
Yeah.
very different, we'll say, animal.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
different
So,
beast to try to tame there.
yeah. So we've even, I've even seen, for example, hell, I'll just call us out on this. When we talked about the role of predators versus habitat in turkey populations, right?
Mhm.
We got some criticism from those episodes. It wasn't a lot, but there were several people who pointed out, and rightly so, that we're sitting here saying that the return on investment from predator control hasn't been adequately documented, right?
Mhm.
But we have some bits and pieces of evidence here and there that indicate that the return on investment for predator control is much less than that for habitat. Um, but some people criticized us and said, well, there's a lot of these habitat management practices that you and I recommend, and others, like Craig Harper, and we also don't have data showing that. I can't go in and show you that if you put the majority of the uplands on your property on a 2-year fire return interval, what the change in your nest success or brood survival is going to be. I don't have those numbers.
Right.
I don't have those numbers.
Yeah.
Now we're getting some data in now that's showing the vegetation conditions associated with greater nest success. Okay,
Yeah.
so that's a step towards that.
Well, and
But
like the example, the video on YouTube with Craig
yes,
and the episodes we've had with him, but if you want to visualize it, it's in that video now that we put up.
right,
That video, it was actually one of our feedback to him, and he kind of highlighted it with numbers on the screen, but
hmm
7% of the landscape was 40 something percent of the nest, and the nest success in those areas was also high. So we have data showing a clear behavioral preference for it, but it's still not an
but it is
experiment.
observational data.
Yes, it's a correlative relationship that
It is.
we can all agree is pretty strong. We've got very little of the landscape in a particular type of thing. And a lot of our hens that we mark and track them go and do their business in it, in this case, nest.
Yeah,
And the ones that chose to do that perform relatively well compared to the ones that chose something different.
yeah.
That's very typical of a wildlife study.
But
So,
that is observational because there
right.
are other things associated with the areas that those hens use that are different from one area to another that we don't
Yeah.
have control or consistency over. And
Yes.
that's what makes it observational versus a manipulative controlled
Right.
experiment.
Which I think you were calling us out, but I think we also have both been pretty vocal about the fact that we
Yeah.
need that data on habitat,
Yeah.
just like we need it on predation. We do have some observational data showing trends where
Yes.
turkey abundance or productivity loosely tie to predator abundance in some cases.
Right.
And there's
Right.
better data in some other species showing those tight knit relationships. But
Right.
you're right. We have been more accepting of the habitat than the predation stuff, or less skeptical, I should say. But
Right.
I think that's because we have a lot better data.
Yes.
The correlational data we have on habitat is way better.
Yeah.
And
So
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, so let me put a wrap on this and we'll continue on with what you were gonna
Put a
say.
bow
But
on it.
yeah, there we go. So the ideal experiment, right, would be if I had my vegetation study and I had my control and I had, treatment 1 through 5 or 6 or whatever I want to look at, and then I had turkeys in each of those plots that I could measure things related to, like, what's their body condition, what's their nest
Mhm.
success rate, what's their brood survival, all those types of things. That'd be a beautiful experiment, right?
Yes.
But the reason oftentimes that we can't is that we can't implement those types of treatments over a large enough scale that they are going to influence turkey demography, number one. And number two, even if we could, we're at the mercy of the animal's behavior. So maybe I do go out on a WMA and I implement, 500 acres of this certain vegetation type using a certain habitat management practice. Now I got to catch turkeys in it.
Mm-hmm.
And not only do I have to catch turkeys in it, but I have to catch them there during wintertime. And
then hope
then
they
they have
use
to
it.
and hope that they use it during the nesting season or whatever season of
Yeah.
life I'm interested in measuring a response to.
So you basically need
And
a really large area to ensure that happens some, and inevitably
right.
some of them are going to leave. We had hens that moved miles, many
Or
miles, right before they nested on
or
our
you're going to
South
have
Florida
hens that
project.
use part of that treatment area and part of another area, so they're
Yeah.
not completely under the influence of that particular treatment. But then even if all that stuff does line, let's say the stars align, you get it worked out, that's one hen.
Mm-hmm. You got
You
to
need
have a
multiple
bunch.
hens exposed to each of these treatments. And so then you can start to understand why it becomes so difficult to implement well-replicated experimental manipulative
Mm-hmm.
designs with measuring wildlife responses, like through vital rates or whatever else you're interested in.
Yeah. That's a really good characterization of it, I think. And it's just so hard to do manipulative stuff, especially for something like a turkey that's so big and mobile, and its
Yeah.
population's fluctuating over relatively long term on top of that. That's
Yeah.
the other problem inlaid here is you don't need just a big spatial scale, you need a large temporal scale to capture the variability that's innate or governed by something more broad like weather. You
And
have
we
to be able
haven't
to.
even talked about the expense associated with it yet.
Yeah, so it just starts adding up. I will let the audience know, they may be interested to know, we are working on right now uh, trying to plan out a large scale habitat manipulation to track vital rate responses of turkeys
Mm-hmm.
in Florida. We have a way that we think we can do that, and we have some interest from a couple of funding mechanisms to potentially do that and to leverage some of the cost share program that we talked about with Buddy. There's also interest in other states, and the Wild Turkey Federation is really interested in raising funds for habitat centric work. So they just have their initiative that they've announced, a 10-year initiative on that. So this isn't impossible, but it's so hard to do a manipulative experiment with a species that's so big.
Yeah.
So we have better data on quail. They're
Mm-hmm.
smaller. Things happen over a shorter time scale in a smaller spatial scale.
Right.
So there's reasons why that occurs, but most of the time we end up when we're designing a study for something like turkeys, we usually end up with a correlative type of study, and that really increases the demand for sample size over long time periods over a
Mm-hmm.
big spatial scale so that we have
Yeah.
tons of individuals with a huge variety, and then we can make really strong correlative relationships between like where did it decide to nest versus what's available to it for choices.
Right.
And
Yeah.
not to demean that kind of work, a lot of that data is excellent data that has been tremendous, and it's the basis of a
Mm-hmm.
lot of what we know about wildlife and
Right.
what we know about turkeys. But if we can move to a more manipulative thing, then we can really, really iron out those things.
Yeah. Do you think we should talk about what it costs to fund these types of studies and what that goes toward?
Yeah, let's talk about. Well, I guess we could talk about the habitat one since we've been on that. If we were gonna do a
I was
manipulative habitat.
Yeah, I was thinking more about, one of these large scale telemetry studies, like if you were
Yeah.
trying to actually evaluate response to treatments. And so just to start off with, if you're putting out GPS backpacks, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those are about 1,000, a little over $1,000 a piece.
Yeah.
So
So
you put out 100 of those over the course of a study, you're already well into the six figures.
Just in the technology to track them.
Yeah, six figures right then and there.
Yeah, and then somebody's got to do it. So then you have costs. We often use a model where we use uh, a graduate student program to do that kind of work. And the graduate student gets trained to do research. They get a stipend associated with that, so that because they can't have a different job, because these graduate students, and we were both there, and I'm glad I'm past it now. But these graduate students are dedicated, like they're working round the clock often for large portions of the year, and sometimes they have families and everything else that is going on. They're trying to take classes during the semesters because they have to complete classwork to develop skills that they need for it, but also to complete their degree program. So there's no way they could have another job. So the model that's pretty typical in our field is for that to have a salary associated with it. It is not, they're not making a good living, but they can live on it.
You're talking 30,000 a year.
Yeah, between 20 and 30 in almost any part of the country is what you're looking at. But the other thing to be said is they're also getting to go to school and getting paid to do that.
Tuition is covered.
And the tuition is often covered, so they're getting to take the classwork pretty much for free, and then getting paid as a research assistant to conduct this work as a part of it. And then we typically, in that model, they would produce a thesis that will inevitably, at some point, we want to get published so that it's vetted through the scientific process. So, that's kind of how that works, but all that is expensive.
Yeah, so I mean, right off the bat there, you're adding another six figures to the total price tag of the project.
Right.
Even though you're paying them that little, over a 4-year study, depending on how you staff it, whether it be like a PhD student, a couple PhDs, several master students, or a PhD master's hybrid, you go ahead pretty quickly, you run it up to a couple $100,000 just for GPS backpacks and the graduate students.
Yeah, and that's for 100 tags in a graduate program.
But wait, there's more, right?
Yeah, you still gotta get there.
Yeah.
So there's travel associated with it.
There's all the gas.
They got to be able to stay somewhere. We're not making them
got to
camp.
pay for them to stay on site. Yeah.
They
used to make them camp on site back in the old days.
I've had some do that.
I know some grad students that tent camped for a whole summer on their field site. I'm just like, man,
that's hardcore.
I
mean, they're dedicated, man. It's really unbelievable, the resilience of some of these students and their passion for it. I mean, you really have to love it.
So a lot of times, we've got all those operation expenses. Oftentimes, you're also hiring undergraduate research technicians. And so these are hourly employees that are helping go out and do the mortality checks on the backpack units, or any number of things, measure vegetation, whatever. It's easy to spend another $20,000-$30,000 a year on paying for those hourly employees.
Well, and that being said, often when we're doing a project like this with the state agency, there's often not enough funding available, and they end up doing a lot of this in kind. Like they have staff that that dedicate time to going out and helping trap. We wouldn't be able to do a lot of this stuff without having the expertise and the availability of these personnel and the dedication of those personnel to do it. They often have equipment like here in Florida. They already, because of trapping turkeys for restocking efforts, they already had a lot of gear that we would have had to purchase if they hadn't had it in kind already. So we use various means like this trying to reduce the cost, because it's often, it starts adding up so fast. And then, that's also where organizations like Turkeys for Tomorrow and the NWTF and Alabama Wildlife Federation, I mean, we got all these organizations And they also often contribute in various ways, some funding to help expand or cover some of these costs. So, it's really important. Some of the local here in Florida that are local chapters of NWTF have been really active with trying to fundraise and helping with projects like that. Private individuals do that. So,
right.
We're already using private donations to support a lot of stuff in my lab, and I would not be able to operate without it.
Right.
So,
Absolutely.
because
Me
it
too.
just
And
the bill just keeps adding up.
oh, it does. And I mean, imagine everything that we just discussed, and then you start trying to roll that out on 5 or 6 study areas.
Yeah.
I mean, it it escalates quickly.
Well, and think
I mean, it's
about
not
too.
uncommon for me to pay 20,000 miles worth of vehicle mileage on a given study in a given year.
Yeah.
And that's
Well,
at
let's also break
50.
that. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Let's break that down for a minute. Let's say we've got the 100 tags we were basing that on. Well, if we do that on 5 areas, now we've got 20 tags per area, and we're going
That's
to do
not
that,
much.
and we're going to do that over 5 years.
Yeah.
So now we have a small sample size each individual year per site, and it's going to be, we're going to have to. I mean, if we were only getting 100 tags, then we'd have 4 tags per site per year.
Yeah.
Which is basically not meaningful at that point.
No.
It's the sample size is too small to make any robust inference. So
Right.
that's why the manipulative stuff doesn't happen as often with especially these large species like this.
Yeah. So a lot of times, as a surrogate for that, what we try to do is we try to start finding areas that differ with regards to the aspects that we're interested in studying. So, maybe we look at turkey vital rates in a landscape that's dominated by industrial pine forest versus one that's dominated by mature hardwood forest or something like that. So we try to look at areas that naturally differ and then try to make inferences off of that, but it's not as powerful.
Right. I think we talked about it in a previous episode, but I'll bring it up again. Another thing that we often leverage is experimental design traits that strengthen the inference by design, and it reduces our need for some of this stuff. Like one of the really common ones that's really effective at doing that is a before-after control impact design. Essentially, what that means, to put it simply for people, is let's say if we're going to do a habitat manipulation, we'd have 2 areas that are side by side. We'll just say, just for ease. The definition of that can get tricky, but we've got 2 populations of turkeys on these properties that we're going to address that, let's say they're 10,000 acres each. We'd go in, track turkeys for 2 or 3 years, all the vital rates on each of those areas to get a baseline before we do anything. And then we randomize it, but one of those areas is then going to get a treatment and the other one's going to remain a control. So now we go into our 2 properties, and one of those 2 gets the implementation of habitat, and let's say the other one remains the same in that regard, and you continue to track turkey vital rates in both, and that allows us to basically attribute things that we observe changing in vital rates on the treatment area to that treatment, because the control area is exposed in theory to all the other variables that might be changing, like weather or cicada hatch or whatever it is.
Right.
So we know the population is going to fluctuate from year to year because of things that we're not controlling. So in that design, we can see, basically how did the control population change just without anything related to habitat. And then we can see what the difference in that change is on the habitat side and attribute that difference to the habitat treatment. So that reduces the need for spatial and temporal replication and sample size just by implementing that kind of design over a correlative model.
Right.
Just immediately, right out of the gate, you reduce all of those key things that are affecting cost.
Right.
So that's kind of why we focused on that type of design for what we're trying to plan out. But another thing that I pretty commonly do, I guess it's pretty common in the literature, but we'll often have treatments. Like, for instance, one of my current master student is working on a tree resprouting study, and it's at Tall Timbers with some of the staff there. But we were looking at fire timing on resprouting and biomass allocation in the plants to try to get at that question we were talking about previously with benefits of timing. And the hardwood encroachment is a really common concern, and there are some
Mm-hmm.
species that you don't want, and other species are native to the system that you might want. And we wanted to see how the timing interacting with deer herbivory would affect which plants are dominating. So in that case, we have these small treatment areas where we're applying fire at different times. It's in a randomized block design, but within that, we have plants paired with and without access from the herbivore.
Mm-hmm.
So now we can basically show how much effect does the herbivore have on the plant when it interacts with the time of fire, because we have the plant with and without the herbivore and all of the timing of fire, right? So, and that also was in a before after control impact on top of it. So we basically monitored all these plants to see what their performance was just under ambient conditions, and then implemented the treatment on some of them.
Right.
So yeah, it gets pretty tricky, but you can do a lot of things with plants like that where you can still get at an important thing. Like, okay, how are these things interacting, with this
Mm-hmm.
white-tailed deers, just like turkeys, or where we have, real issues trying to isolate variables at the scale that's needed to make population inferences or vital rate inferences for that species. But we can still look at other processes that they're really important in, uh, with clever design and changing slightly what your response variable that you're measuring is. In that case, where we
Yeah.
changed it to a plant that allowed us to gain some inferential power about what the role of deer is in that hardwood encroachment problem.
Right. Makes sense. Yeah, and I think one of the things that you brought up there towards the end of that explanation was really important too, and that's the variables that we choose to measure.
Mm-hmm.
Which a lot of people probably don't think about, but it can be difficult to decide what to measure. Partly from a logistical standpoint, certain types of data take longer and are thus more expensive
Mm-hmm.
to collect than others. Um, but oftentimes too, let's say we're trying to measure hen nest site selection, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have this concept in our heads of what a hen is looking for, but we really don't know how closely that approximates. We can't ask a hen what exactly that she's looking for, right?
Mm-hmm.
We try to approximate it, and we usually get better at knowing what they're looking for over time
Yeah.
as we collect data and perform additional experiments. But sometimes the things that we measure aren't really what the animal cares about as much.
Yeah.
And so that can be a difficult process to go through, trying to figure out what to measure as well as how to measure it.
Mm-hmm.
Like for instance, one of the things that people think about a lot of times when managing wildlife populations is they have to have adequate cover,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
How do you measure adequate cover?
Yeah.
Right? Is
What
that
does
something
adequate mean?
anybody's ever thought about? Like you see, there's these really, I think, useful demonstrations that, like, I've seen, Bronson Strickland at Mississippi State do with like fawning cover, where you throw a
Mm.
basketball out in an area and you see how far away you can see it from. But we can't put that in a peer reviewed paper,
Right.
right? So,
It's like an
we have these
index,
various,
visual
yeah,
index for you.
yeah, so we create these various tools like, vertical boards that have, different colored paint at different levels and things like that. And we see how many of those we can see from a certain distance at a certain height that we think is relative to the animal, for instance. We have all sorts of different ways that we measure like vegetation as we think it pertains to what the animal is looking for, whether that be from a cover perspective from predators or cover for their young, or forage, like food availability too.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And again, we have tons of data on these species that are really strong because the correlative studies have been done over a bunch of places with many, many, many animals over long time periods. So we start to really get a good idea of some of these things. Really strong inference. And the last step, I guess, to that is to take that experimental one so that you can actually associate, okay, I increased my brooding cover by X amount from this proportion of what was available to this proportion, and that equates to this much change in that vital rate, which is really important information when you start making habitat recommendations, especially at broad scales. What those kinds of things. What we do know is that if a bunch of studies show that brooding cover seems to be limited across the landscape based on all these studies, and we're seeing poor broods, if you implement brooding
it
cover,
stands to reason.
Yeah, well, if you implement brooding cover on your property, that should convey a positive response. We have enough data to say that. We know. Also, I think we can be a little stronger on this because it is commonplace to have abundant game. You can pick your species with abundant predators, but it is uncommon to have abundant game with a paucity habitat, which is always facetiously say. That's why I don't have any in the room right here with me. It's not adequate. So.
Are we going into this topic right now?
No, we're not. That's all I want to say.
That's one that we've meant to get into, and like you bringing that up has me salivating over it now.
Oh yeah, well we're gonna save that for its own episode, buddy.
Oh yeah,
so I love that one. I didn't want to get us too distracted because the other thing I think is pretty important is you also need to have a good idea about how the system's operating. So we know, for instance, weather might play a big role in nesting success. Yeah. Well, we often, in cases like that, try to get measures of those factors that we know are important, and they're distracting us from our actual question.
Nuisance variables.
Yeah, so if we're trying to see how nesting success responds to the implementation of habitat management practices that we think increase nesting cover or quality of nesting cover or availability or whatever, which is also another thing. You're actually, the definition of that matters a lot for how you implement the treatments. But my point is, if we want to get a true measure of how nests are responding to the implementation of that treatment, we need to control for factors that influence nesting that aren't related to that treatment, like weather.
Right.
Maybe it rained a lot this year. So that before-after control impact, the Baki design, that is helping us.
In Alabama, we call it the Baki design.
The Baki. I've heard it called Bachi. Basi. Anyway, that design helps us with that a lot because, in theory, those other factors are the same between the treatment area and the control area.
Yeah, so like maybe you get a good rainfall year, meaning adequate but not too much, and nest success increases by 10% across the board. Yeah. But you also see in your treatment where you improved nesting cover, it increased 20%, let's say.
Exactly.
So you got that weather effect increasing nest success, but you saw in addition to that, because you had the control, that it was another 10% on top of it where you implemented the treatment.
Yeah, that's a good point. So if we took those two areas and we tracked nesting success for 3 or 4 years on both, and we know that they're basically the same, or we know how they're different to start with.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we have that before or after part of it.
Yeah.
Because we want to know the areas are comparable, or if they're different, how much they're different. We don't want to just go in and implement those treatments on each area when one of them already had double nesting success of the other area anyway.
Absolutely.
Right? Because then we would overestimate the value of that treatment, or underestimate it if you flip them. So that's when we have that before after. The control impact part is really important for what you just said. If we have a year that rainfall just happens to be perfect for nesting, we just might see nesting success as an ambient response to that weather condition go up across the board. So we'll know in your example, 10% of that is associated with the rain, and then the habitat treatment increased nesting over and above and beyond that rainfall. If we didn't have the control in that case, we would have overestimated the role of habitat.
Yeah.
We didn't take into account the fact that it was just a good year.
Right. And this is why it's very important to be cautious when making inferences about something that you do on the property that you manage or hunt without having a control. Because you see a change, but you don't know that change may have occurred all around you at a large scale, but without having that control, you can't know whether or not things changed over that time period.
Well, and that, we belabored that on trapping. But we have not on habitat as much. The same is true for habitat.
That's right.
Don't implement a bunch of habitat stuff and then think, oh, well, the response I see next year is going to determine whether that was successful. One way that you could probably sort of gauge that is like, okay, man, I implemented trapping or these brood patches, and my poult per hen doubled this year. Well, what happened at the state level, right?
Yeah.
We've got brood surveys again. I want to emphasize.
Or better yet, maybe you have a brood survey at the regional level in your state.
Maybe so. But one thing is make sure you're participating in those. I'll give that another plug because they're ongoing in a bunch of states right now, and you can participate in them. But also, you could use that data when it becomes public to kind of gauge what did your observations look like relative to what happened at the state level or at the local level if you're lucky enough to have that data in your local area.
I think a perfect illustration of this is, I can't remember if it was the predator removal study that Dan Speake did in Alabama back in the day, or if it was the one that Lovett Williams Jr. did in Florida during that same time period, but they saw a 70% nest success rate on the predator removal area, but they had a control paired with it, and it was like 70% on the control that was adjacent to it.
It was almost the same.
If they hadn't had that control, it was like,
oh man, that's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, we could have unlimited turkeys if we do this everywhere. But they realized that, it was high on the adjacent site where no trapping occurred. So,
yeah. So, I think we've kind of, I don't know that exhausted the topic is the right word, but I think we covered it pretty well. Is there any other thoughts that you have?
I mean, just briefly, from there, you design your experiment, and that dictates, what the project cost is going to be, because it dictates, how much money you're going to do to drive around and do this and that, how many people you need to hire to do it, and all that kind of thing. And then, they typically have defined periods that we oftentimes refer to as field seasons, where they go out and they're capturing the turkeys, or they're monitoring the turkeys, or they're measuring the vegetation, or they're burning and implementing fire treatments. And they're collecting data in a standardized way that whole time on the variables, like we talked about earlier, that we think are important to describe what it is we're interested in capturing. And then at the end of those field seasons, we're analyzing the data using statistical techniques in a way that allows us to try to further isolate the effects of the variables that we're interested in, and trying to interpret those data and write those up into publications.
Yeah. No, I think and that's kind of one of the point, if you were in a correlative study design, it's not that you can't take into account some of those other co-varying factors. We just have to measure them at the right scale and then we can include them in our analytical approach to try to basically capture the variation that's associated with that one variable that we don't really care about. It would be a random effect. Be a good way to think about it. So
that's it. Hopefully they got what they wanted from that one.
Yeah, well, I'm sure folks will let us know if they didn't. Yeah, it's definitely complicated, but it's a lot of fun, and it's really rewarding when you start to get at answers that people really care about and that positively affect the resource.
The hardest thing about it for me is the payoff is so long.
Yeah, it often is. It takes so long, and people are just chomping at the bits for it. And it's like, man, I just don't have enough yet. And I hate telling people, yeah, we don't really have the data. I would love to have it, but I don't even have a way to fund the research that would take 10 years to find out.
Yeah, I mean, probably my most extensive research project that I've ever completed from the time it was we first discussed it, had approval to move forward with it from the funding agency till the time it was completed and published was over 7 years. 7-8 years.
Yep. I'd say that's pretty reasonable. You start wanting to do some of these broad scale manipulations, we're probably talking about a 10-year project minimum there.
Yeah. And we do, I will say, run into some difficulties with that because oftentimes funding agencies can't commit beyond 4 or 5 years to a research project. So, but there's things like, fire season, fire timing, all those sorts of research questions that, you may need 10, 15 years to fully realize the effects of the treatment that you implemented.
Yep. Good point. All right. Well,
maybe there's 2 people still listening.
Yeah, I was going to say we've been going on a while now, so I think we can probably close it down here. Let us know if you want to hear more content like this, or you have questions based on what we've brought up. We're all ears. So thanks everybody for listening, for helping us with sharing and rating and all that stuff. It's been so valuable, and we really appreciate all the feedback and engagement.
Thank y'all. Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.